The red sand of Proxima 7 flew through the air as another plasma blast hit the ground near Captain Li Wujin. He pressed his body closer to the twisted metal that served as his cover and felt the heat from the alien weapon wash over his back. The Kelvin soldiers were advancing again with their tall gray bodies moving in perfect formation across the battlefield. Their forearms carried weapons that could melt through steel, and their cold black eyes showed no emotion as they fired at the human positions. Li Wujin had been fighting the Kelvin Empire for 2 years now, and he still could not understand how they thought. The aliens were taller than humans, with skin like smooth stone, and voices that sounded like machines when they spoke through their translators. They had better weapons, better ships, and better armor, but somehow the humans kept finding ways to fight back. The war had started when the Kelvins decided that human worlds were perfect for their expansion, and that humans were just another species to be removed. Private Kim Da-eun crawled up beside her captain with dirt covering her young face. Her rifle was almost out of power, and her uniform was torn from crawling through debris all morning. She had joined the military only 6 months ago, and this was her third major battle. The girl was scared, but she kept fighting because that was what humans did. They did not give up even when everything seemed hopeless. The sound of boots on metal made Li Wujin turn his head. Corporal Park Min-ho was moving between the defensive positions with medical supplies in his backpack. The man was supposed to be a communications specialist, but during battles he always seemed to end up helping the medics. Park Min-ho had a way of appearing wherever someone was hurt, and he never seemed to care about the danger to himself. Another wave of plasma fire lit up the morning sky, and Li Wujin could see the Kelvin battle formation moving closer. They had at least 200 soldiers advancing while the humans had maybe 50 fighters left in this section of the battle. The odds were terrible, but that had never stopped humans before. Li Wujin raised his rifle and began picking targets among the advancing aliens. The Kelvin soldiers moved like they were dancing. Some ancient programmed behavior that made them advance in perfect lines, while their weapons fired in coordinated patterns. It was beautiful in a deadly way, but it also made them predictable. Human fighters had learned to use this against them by creating chaos and confusion that broke up their formations. Kim Da-eun suddenly screamed, and Li Wujin turned to see her rolling on the ground with her hands pressed against her shoulder. A plasma bolt had found its mark and burned through her armor. The smell of cooked flesh filled the air, and the girl was crying from pain and shock. Her left shoulder was badly damaged and blood was seeping through her fingers. Without thinking, Park Min-ho dropped his rifle and ran toward the wounded girl. Plasma bolts were still flying through the air, and one missed his head by inches, but he did not slow down. He grabbed Kim Da-eun under her arms and began dragging her toward the human medical tent that was set up behind the main battle line. His boots slipped in the sand and he fell twice, but he kept pulling her to safety. From their positions on the ridge above the battle, the Kelvin observers watched this scene with confusion. In their military tradition, wounded soldiers were left where they fell. If they could not continue fighting, then they had served their purpose and their bodies would be honored later. This human behavior of risking additional lives to save one injured soldier made no sense to them. The Kelvin commander Vextar studied the human battle through his viewing scope and shook his massive head. These creatures had been fighting his forces for 3 years, and they continued to surprise him with their strange tactics. They would charge directly into plasma fire to rescue wounded comrades. They would give up strategic positions to help civilians evacuate. They would share their food and medical supplies with prisoners. Inside the human medical tent, Dr. Choi Ji-won was already working on 3 wounded soldiers when Park Min-ho burst through the entrance with Kim Da-eun in his arms. The doctor was a small woman with steady hands and tired eyes. She had been operating almost continuously for 18 hours, but she immediately cleared space on her makeshift operating table. The medical tent was not really a proper hospital. It was made from salvaged materials and military tarps with equipment that had been repaired so many times that it barely functioned. Dr. Choi had built her surgical tools from spare parts, and her medical computers were held together with wire and hope. But somehow she kept saving lives that should have been lost. Nurse Han So-ra was assisting the doctor, and she moved with the efficiency that came from months of practice in battlefield medicine. She had started the war as a supply clerk, but had learned medical skills because the human forces needed every person to help. However, her hands were steady as she prepared bandages and monitored the patient's vital signs. More wounded soldiers were brought into the tent throughout the morning. Some were carried by their friends and others crawled in by themselves. All of them received the same level of care regardless of their rank or their chances of survival. Dr. Choi worked on each patient as if that person was the most important human in the universe. The Kelvin communication specialists had been monitoring human radio traffic all day, and what they heard from the medical tent confused their analysts. Humans were using valuable resources and risking additional casualties to save soldiers who might never fight again. Some of the wounded would need months of recovery time and others would be disabled for life. Yet the humans kept spending time and energy on them. Private Yun Tai Ho had been brought in with his left leg, nearly severed by a plasma blast. Any rational military force would have given him pain medication and let him die quietly. But Dr. Choi worked for 4 hours to save his leg, and when that failed, she worked for 2 more hours to save his life. The operation used medical supplies that could have treated 10 minor injuries, but no one in the medical tent questioned the decision. As the battle continued outside the medical tent, more casualties arrived. Corporal Lim Dong-wook came in with burns covering half his body. Private Oh Sung-min had taken shrapnel in his chest and was unconscious. Sergeant Kim Hae-jin had a head injury that left her confused and unable to remember her own name. Each one received the full attention of the medical staff. The Kelvin forces had superior technology and better training, but they were beginning to understand that they were fighting an enemy that operated by completely different rules. These humans valued individual lives over military efficiency. They would sacrifice strategic advantages to save single soldiers. They treated their wounded with the same care that Kelvins reserved for their most important leaders. Commander Vextar watched the human medical tent through his scope and felt something that Kelvins rarely experienced: uncertainty. His species had conquered 12 different worlds and defeated 8 different intelligent species, but none of them had fought like humans. The contradiction between human violence and human compassion was something that Kelvin military doctrine had no way to address. As night fell over the battlefield, the fighting gradually stopped, but the work in the medical tent continued. Dr. Choi had not slept in over 20 hours, but she kept working on patient after patient. Her hands moved with automatic precision as she cleaned wounds and administered medication. Nurse Han brought her food that she ate without stopping her work. The wounded soldiers who could still speak talked quietly among themselves about friends who had been killed and battles they had fought. They shared stories and made jokes despite their pain. They planned what they would do when they recovered and talked about letters they wanted to write to their families. This behavior was as foreign to the Kelvin observers as the medical procedures themselves. In the Kelvin military tradition, soldiers who could not fight were simply removed from consideration. They were not cruel about it, but they were practical. Wounded warriors were given honor and then forgotten. The idea of investing time and resources in soldiers who might never return to service was completely outside their understanding. But the humans in the medical tent were creating something that the Kelvins had never seen before. They were building bonds between individuals that made their military units stronger rather than weaker. The soldier who had been saved by his comrades would fight harder to save others. The medic who had worked all night to save lives would be protected by soldiers who remembered her cares. The first day of battle ended. Both sides prepared for what would come next. But something had changed in the way the Kelvin command structure viewed their human enemies. These creatures were not just another species to be conquered. They were something new and unpredictable, and that made them far more dangerous than anyone had realized. 3 days after the fighting stopped on Proxima 7, something happened that had never occurred before in the war between humans and Kelvins. The Kelvin High Command sent a message to the human forces requesting permission to visit their medical facilities under a flag of truce. Commander Vextar himself had ordered this unprecedented action after reviewing reports from his battlefield observers who could not understand how humans kept so many wounded soldiers alive. Dr. Velcor was the most respected physician in the entire Kelvin Empire, and he had been chosen to lead this medical inspection team. The tall gray alien had studied medicine for over 200 years and had treated injuries from dozens of different species across the galaxy. But the reports he had read about human medical practices seemed impossible to him. No rational species would waste so many resources on soldiers who might never fight again. The Kelvin medical team wore full environmental suits as they descended from their ship to the surface of Proxima 7. Their equipment included advanced scanners that could analyze biological processes at the molecular level, and their medical knowledge was based on centuries of scientific research. They expected to find primitive conditions and basic procedures that would explain why human medicine was so inefficient. Dr. Choi Ji-won met the alien medical team at the entrance to the human camp. She had agreed to this exchange because she hoped to learn something from advanced alien technology that might help her save more lives. The small human doctor looked exhausted after days of continuous surgery, but her eyes showed curiosity, rather than fear, when she saw the towering Kelvin physicians through universal translators. Dr. Choi began explaining human medical procedures to her alien visitors. She showed them the triage system where wounded soldiers were sorted by severity of injury and likelihood of survival. But what confused the Kelvins was that humans did not simply abandon the cases with poor prognosis. Instead, they worked harder on the most difficult patients. The human medical tent was a collection of salvaged materials and improvised equipment that would have been considered primitive even by human civilian standards. But Dr. Choi spoke about her tools and procedures with the same pride that Kelvin doctors showed when discussing their advanced technology. She explained how they had turned communication devices into heart monitors and how weapons power cells were used to run surgical equipment. Nurse Han Sora was preparing medication for the wounded soldiers, and she demonstrated how they had learned to synthesize antibiotics from local plant materials when their supplies ran low. The Kelvin observers recorded everything, but they could not understand why humans would spend time developing such crude alternatives when logic suggested that soldiers with infections should simply be allowed to die quickly. Dr. Velcor examined the human medical equipment with his 4 arms working independently to scan and analyze each device. His initial assessment was that this technology was at least 50 years behind Kelvin medical science. But as he watched the human medical staff work, he began to notice something that his scientific training had not prepared him for. Private Kim Da-yoon was one of the patients in the medical tent, and her shoulder wound was healing slowly with visible scarring that would affect her mobility for the rest of her life. In Kelvan society, she would have been classified as a strategic loss and removed from active consideration. But Dr. Choi checked on her every few hours and spoke to her with genuine concern about her pain levels and recovery progress. The alien doctors watched as Nurse Han spent time talking to patients who were clearly going to survive their injuries. This seemed like a waste of valuable medical resources because the conversation served no therapeutic purpose that Kelvin science could identify. But the human medical staff acted as if these interactions were as important as surgery or medication. Corporal Park Min-ho had been helping in the medical tent since the battle ended. Even though he was not trained as a medic, he carried supplies, moved patients, and cleaned equipment while asking Dr. Choi to explain various procedures. The Kelvin observers noted that he was learning medical skills that might never be useful to him in his actual military role. Dr. Velcor began to experience something that Kelvins rarely felt: confusion about fundamental concepts that he had always taken for granted. The human medical practices seemed to violate basic principles of resource management and efficiency, but the results suggested that these methods were somehow effective. The contradiction created a feeling in his mind that had no equivalent in Kelvin language. The demonstration continued with Dr. Choi explaining how they had treated Private Yoon Tae-ho after his leg amputation. The surgery had taken 6 hours and used medical supplies that could have treated multiple minor injuries. But the human doctor described the operation as if it had been routine rather than an enormous waste of resources. What disturbed Dr. Velcor most was watching Dr. Choi examine Yoon Tae-ho during his recovery. The young soldier would never be able to serve in combat again, and his medical care was consuming resources that could benefit soldiers who might return to active duty. But Dr. Choi treated him with the same attention and respect that she showed to patients who were expected to make full recoveries. Nurse Han demonstrated how they had improvised physical therapy equipment to help wounded soldiers regain mobility and strength. The exercises served no immediate military purpose, and some of the patients would never return to combat effectiveness. But the human medical staff worked with each patient as if their individual recovery was a strategic priority. The Kelvin medical team began to realize that they were observing something that their scientific education had told them was impossible. The humans were making medical decisions based on factors that had nothing to do with military efficiency or resource optimization. Each wounded soldier was treated as if their individual life had value, beyond their contribution to the war effort. Dr. Velcor watched Dr. Choi work on a patient named Oh Seung-min, who had sustained a severe head injury. The soldier was conscious but confused, and might never recover his full mental abilities. In Kelvin medical practice, he would have been given comfort care and allowed to die naturally. But Dr. Choi was running cognitive tests and planning rehabilitation therapy as if his recovery was certain. The alien physicians observed that human medical staff often worked longer hours than were medically advisable for their own health. Dr. Choi had been awake for over 30 hours, but she continued to check on patients and perform procedures. Nurse Han had donated her own blood when supplies ran low, and other soldiers had volunteered to help with medical tasks. Despite having no training, as the demonstration progressed, Dr. Velcor began to notice physical changes in his own body. His breathing became irregular and his skin color shifted to a darker gray. His advanced medical training told him that he was experiencing stress responses, but he could not identify the cause. The human medical procedures were primitive, but they were not dangerous to observe. The other Kelvin medical officers were also showing signs of distress. Their scanning equipment detected elevated neurological activity and irregular brain patterns. But none of them could explain why watching human medical procedures was affecting them so strongly. The contradiction between human logic and human behavior was creating psychological pressure that their minds could not resolve. Dr. Choi noticed that her alien visitors seemed uncomfortable, and she offered to provide them with chairs and refreshments. The simple act of concern for their well-being from a member of an enemy species added another layer of confusion to what the Kelvins were experiencing. They had come to study primitive medical techniques, and instead they were encountering concepts that challenged their understanding of consciousness itself. The medical tent contained wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict, and Dr. Choi explained that they treated Kelvin prisoners with the same care as human patients. This policy seemed to violate every principle of military strategy that the alien observers understood. Enemy soldiers should be interrogated for information, and then disposed of efficiently, not given expensive medical treatment. Nurse Han was helping a wounded Kelvin prisoner named Zek Nor, who had been captured during the battle. His injuries were minor, but she was monitoring his vital signs and providing pain medication with the same attention she gave to human patients. The contradiction between human warfare and human compassion was becoming more apparent with each observation. Dr. Velcor realized that he was witnessing something that Kelvin science had declared impossible. These humans possessed the ability to hold contradictory concepts in their minds without losing their sanity. They could be efficient killers in battle and compassionate healers in the medical tent, and somehow both behaviors strengthened their military effectiveness. The demonstration was supposed to last for 2 hours, but it had already continued for 4 hours because the Kelvin medical team kept asking questions about human procedures that seemed to defy logic. How could a species survive when they wasted so many resources on individuals who might never contribute to group success? How could medical staff maintain efficiency while allowing emotional attachments to patients as the day continued? Dr. Velcor felt his understanding of medicine and consciousness beginning to break down. Everything he had learned about efficient resource allocation and logical decision-making was being challenged by what? Dr. Velcor was examining a human patient named Sergeant Kim Hee-jin, who had suffered a severe head injury during the recent battle. The Kelvin physician was using his advanced scanner to map the damage to her brain tissue, while Dr. Choi explained how they had managed to keep her alive despite having no proper neurosurgical equipment. The human doctor spoke about the patient as if her recovery was certain, even though the scans showed permanent cognitive damage. The contradiction between the medical reality and the human response suddenly became too much for Dr. Velcor's mind to process. His forelegs began to tremble, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. The other Kelvin medical officers noticed their colleague distress, but they could not understand what was causing it. Dr. Velcor had examined thousands of patients from dozens of species, but nothing had ever affected him like this. Nurse Han Sora was sitting beside Kim Hee-jin, holding her hand and speaking softly to the confused soldier. The sergeant could not remember her own name or recognize her friends, but the human nurse continued to treat her with gentle respect. This behavior served no medical purpose that Kelvin science could identify, yet it was clearly considered important by the human medical staff. Dr. Velkor's scanning equipment detected massive neurological activity in his own brain as he tried to process what he was observing. The human medical practices violated every principle of efficient resource allocation that governed Kelvin society, but somehow they were producing results that should have been impossible with such primitive equipment. The contradiction created a feedback loop in his mind that grew stronger with each observation. Tall alien physician suddenly collapsed to the floor of the medical tent with a sound that shook the makeshift equipment. His massive body twitched as his forearms moved independently, and his breathing became irregular. Dr. Choi immediately dropped what she was doing and rushed to help the fallen Kelvin, despite not knowing anything about their physiology. The sight of a human doctor attempting to provide medical care to a member of the enemy species while her own wounded soldiers watched created another wave of psychological shock among the remaining Kelvin observers. Dr. Velkor had collapsed because his mind could not process human behavior. But now Dr. Choi was demonstrating that same impossible behavior by trying to help him. The other Kelvin medical officers backed away from their fallen colleague in alarm. Their scanning devices showed that Dr. Velkor was experiencing something that had no equivalent in their medical databases. His brain activity was off the charts, but he was not having a seizure or stroke. Instead, his mind seemed to be trying to process contradictory information that could not be resolved through normal Kelvin logic. Dr. Choi knelt beside the fallen alien and began checking his vital signs with her primitive medical scanner. She had no training in Kelvin physiology, but she applied the same systematic approach that she used with human patients. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she monitored his breathing and tried to determine what was wrong. Private Yoon Tai-ho, who was recovering from his leg amputation, struggled to sit up in his bed so he could see what was happening. When he saw Dr. Choi helping the enemy physician, he began to get out of bed despite his injury. Other wounded humans in the medical tent also tried to help in whatever way they could, even though these aliens had been trying to kill them just days earlier. The second Kelvin medical officer, Dr. Kexmar, began to experience the same symptoms as his colleague. The sight of wounded human soldiers trying to help their fallen enemy while ignoring their own pain created a psychological cascade that his mind could not handle. He had studied over 50 different species, but none of them had ever shown this level of contradictory behavior. Dr. Kexmar fell to his knees as his brain tried to process the impossible scene before him. Humans were demonstrating the ability to be compassionate toward enemies while simultaneously maintaining their military effectiveness. This should have made them weak and vulnerable, but instead it seemed to make them stronger and more unpredictable. Nurse Han left Kim Hee-jin bedside to help Dr. Choi with the collapsed aliens. She brought medical supplies and monitoring equipment while wounded human soldiers offered to assist in any way possible. The entire medical tent had become focused on helping the enemy physicians who had come to study their primitive procedures. The third Kelvin observer, Dr. Zixtel, was recording everything with his advanced equipment, but the data he was collecting made no sense according to his understanding of biology and psychology. Humans were displaying behavior patterns that should have led to species extinction through resource depletion, but instead they had created a military force that had been fighting the Kelvin Empire to a standstill for 3 years. Dr. Choi managed to stabilize Dr. Velkor's vital signs, and she began administering oxygen while monitoring his brain activity through her crude scanning equipment. The irony was not lost on the remaining Kelvin observers that their most advanced physician was being treated with primitive human medical technology by a doctor who had no knowledge of his species. The psychological pressure continued to build as more contradictions became apparent. Dr. Choi was using valuable medical supplies on enemy aliens while her own soldiers needed treatment. She was risking her own safety by handling unknown alien physiology. She was diverting attention from human patients who had a better claim on her time and resources. Dr. Zixtel began to experience the same neurological cascade as his colleagues. The human behavior was creating logical paradoxes that Kelvin minds could not resolve. Humans seemed to operate on principles that contradicted each other, yet somehow both sets of principles made them more effective as a species, rather than canceling each other out, one by one the remaining Kelvin. Medical officers began to collapse as their minds tried to process the impossible contradictions they were witnessing. Human soldiers, who had been shooting at Kelvins during the battle, were now helping to monitor alien vital signs and fetch medical supplies for their treatment. Private Kim Da-yoon, despite her injured shoulder, was helping to organize the medical response to the collapsed aliens. She directed other wounded soldiers to bring blankets and water, while Dr. Choi worked to understand Kelvin physiology through trial and error. The girl who had been screaming in pain just days earlier was now focused entirely on helping the enemy medical team. The human medical staff found themselves treating 6 collapsed Kelvin physicians while still caring for their own wounded soldiers. No one questioned the decision to help their former enemies. The wounded humans simply accepted that injured beings needed medical care regardless of which side they had been fighting for. Corporal Park, Minho began setting up additional monitoring equipment for the alien patients even though he had no training in Kelvin medicine. He worked alongside Dr. Choi to create a system for tracking alien vital signs using human medical technology. The contradiction between his role as a soldier and his actions as a caregiver was exactly the kind of paradox that had broken the Kelvin minds. Dr. Choi realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. An entire team of enemy medical officers had suffered psychological collapse simply from observing human medical practices. The implications were staggering, because it suggested that human consciousness operated on principles that other species could not understand or duplicate. The collapsed Kelvin physicians were experiencing what their medical computers could only classify as severe psychological trauma, but the cause was not violence or physical injury. Instead, their minds had been overwhelmed by witnessing behavior that contradicted their fundamental understanding of how intelligent species should operate. As Dr. Choi worked to stabilize the alien patients, she began to understand that this medical exchange had revealed something profound about human nature. The ability to hold contradictory values simultaneously without losing sanity or effectiveness was apparently unique to humans. Other species saw this as impossible, but for humans it was simply how they lived. The medical tent had become a laboratory for studying the differences between human and alien consciousness. The Kelvin observers had come to study primitive medical techniques, but instead they had discovered that humans possessed psychological capabilities that other species could not even comprehend. Nurse Han continued to care for both human and alien patients with the same level of attention and compassion. The wounded soldiers helped however they could despite their own injuries and pain. The entire scene demonstrated the human ability to extend care and protection even to former enemies. The contradiction between human warfare and human mercy had created a psychological weapon more powerful than any plasma cannon or advanced technology. The Kelvin medical team had been defeated not by superior firepower but by witnessing behavior that their minds could not process. Dr. Choi looked around the medical tent at the unconscious alien physicians and the wounded human soldiers who were helping to care for them. She realized that they had just discovered something that would change the entire course of the war between their species. 12 hours passed before Dr. Velcor finally opened his 4 eyes and found himself lying on a human medical cot, with primitive monitoring equipment attached to his gray skin. The Kelvin physician felt confused and disoriented, as if he had awakened from a dream that had changed something fundamental about how his mind worked. Dr. Choi was sitting nearby reviewing brain scans on her crude medical computer with the same focused attention she gave to all her patients. The first thing Dr. Velcor noticed was that his thinking felt different. The logical frameworks that had governed his decisions for over 2 centuries seemed fragile and incomplete, as if they were missing crucial pieces of information. He tried to remember what had caused his collapse, but the memories created the same psychological pressure that had overwhelmed him before. Dr. Choi approached the alien physician with a gentle manner that seemed impossible, given that they had been enemies just days earlier. she explained, that he had been unconscious for half a day, and that his brain activity had shown patterns unlike anything in human medical literature. The small doctor spoke to him as if his well-being was genuinely important to her. Through careful questioning, Dr. Velcourt began to understand what had happened to him and his colleagues. The human medical practices had created logical paradoxes that Kelvin minds could not resolve. Humans possessed the ability to hold contradictory principles simultaneously, without losing their effectiveness as individuals or as a species. Private Quan Jihai had lost both her arms in the recent battle, but she was learning to write with her feet so she could send letters to the families of dead soldiers. This activity served no logical purpose and consumed energy that should have been used for her recovery, but she considered it important work. The contradiction between rational resource management and emotional commitment was something that Dr. Velcourt mind still struggled to process. The Kelvin physician watched as Corporal Lim Dong-wook, who could barely walk with his injuries, was helping to organize blood donations for wounded Kelvin prisoners. The human soldier was using his recovery time to benefit enemy aliens who had been trying to kill him during the battle. This behavior defied every principle of survival and self-preservation that governed Kelvin society. Dr. Choi explained that humans had evolved the ability to be both logical and emotional, both selfish and selfless, both violent and compassionate within the same individual. This psychological flexibility had allowed them to develop survival strategies that seemed contradictory, but were actually complementary. Each human could adapt their behavior to different situations without losing their core identity. The revelation that shattered Dr. Velcourt's understanding was that humans used these contradictions as a source of strength rather than weakness. A human soldier could fight with brutal efficiency to protect his comrades and then show mercy to defeated enemies without seeing any conflict between these actions. The same person could make coldly logical tactical decisions and emotionally driven medical choices. Nurse Han Sora demonstrated this principle perfectly as she cared for patients throughout the medical tent. She could efficiently triage wounded soldiers based on their chances of survival, while also spending time comforting those who were dying. Her medical decisions were both rational and emotional, and somehow this made her more effective rather than less. Dr. Velcourt began to understand that Kelvin military intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood human psychology. They had assumed that human compassion was a weakness that could be exploited through psychological warfare. But the opposite was true. Human compassion made them more unpredictable and more resilient, because they could find meaning and motivation in situations that would break other species. The other Kelvin medical officers were slowly recovering from their psychological collapse, but each one was experiencing the same fundamental shift in their understanding of consciousness. Dr. Keksmar had spent his entire career studying efficient medical resource allocation, but now he was watching humans waste supplies on hopeless cases and somehow achieve better overall results. Dr. Zixtel was documenting everything, but his reports to the Kelvin High Command would be almost impossible for his superiors to understand. How could he explain that humans had defeated their observers not through superior technology, but by demonstrating psychological capabilities that seemed to violate the laws of natural selection? Wounded human soldiers continued to help care for the collapsed alien physicians, even though logic suggested they should focus on their own recovery. Private Kim Da-eun was teaching basic Korean phrases to Dr. Velcourt so he could communicate better with the human medical staff. Her injured shoulder made movement painful, but she ignored her discomfort to help an enemy. Dr. Choi began explaining human medical philosophy to the recovering Kelvin physicians. She described how they had developed the concept of treating patients as individuals rather than as strategic resources. Each wounded person received care based on their needs rather than their value to the military. This approach should have led to inefficiency, but somehow it created stronger military units. The human medical staff had noticed that patients who received compassionate care recovered faster and returned to duty with higher morale. Soldiers who knew they would be cared for if wounded fought more effectively because they trusted their comrades. The contradiction between individual care and military efficiency had resolved itself in ways that Kelvin military science could not predict. Dr. Velcourt realized that his species had been fighting a war against an enemy They could not understand humans operated on principles that Kelvins could not duplicate or counter through conventional military tactics. The psychological weapon of human compassion was more powerful than any physical technology because it created unpredictable behavior patterns. The Kelvin physician began to see that human consciousness was not just different from Kelvin consciousness, it was fundamentally more complex. Humans could process multiple contradictory concepts simultaneously and use the tension between them to generate creative solutions to problems that would stump more logical species. Sergeant Oh Sung-min was still recovering from his head injury, and his memory remained fragmented, but the human medical staff continued to work with him as if his full recovery was certain. Dr. Choi explained that hope was a crucial component of human medicine. Even when logic suggested that treatment was futile, humans continued to try because the act of trying had value beyond the immediate results. This concept was perhaps the most difficult for Dr. Velcour to understand. Humans could work toward goals that they knew might be impossible and find meaning in the effort itself. This psychological trait made them incredibly persistent and difficult to defeat because they could continue fighting, even when victory seemed hopeless. The medical exchange had become something far more significant than anyone had intended. The collapsed Kelvin physicians were experiencing a fundamental evolution in their understanding of consciousness and intelligence. They were learning that there were forms of thinking that their species had never developed. Dr. Choi showed Dr. Velcour the records of patients they had treated over the past months. The human medical staff had saved soldiers who should have died, lost patients who should have lived, and continued working in conditions that should have broken their spirits. But somehow their overall effectiveness had remained high. The key was that humans did not try to optimize individual decisions, but rather created systems that could adapt to contradictory demands. A medical tent that could be both efficient and compassionate, both logical and emotional, could handle situations that would overwhelm more specialized approaches. Dr. Velcour began to understand that the war between humans and Kelvins was not really about territory or resources. It was about two completely different approaches to consciousness and existence. The Kelvins had assumed that their logical approach was superior, but the humans had proven that consciousness could be more complex. As the alien physicians prepared to return to their ship, they carried with them information that would change how the Kelvin Empire understood intelligence and warfare. The humans had won this exchange not through superior medical technology, but by demonstrating that the mind itself could be more powerful and flexible than anyone had imagined. The medical tent had become a place where two species had discovered that consciousness was far stranger and more wonderful than either had previously understood. The humans had shown that contradictions could be a source of strength and that compassion could be a form of power. The reports that Dr. Velcour and his team sent back to the Kelvin High Command created chaos in the alien military hierarchy. For the first time in their recorded history, the Kelvin Empire faced an enemy that could not be understood through conventional analysis. The medical officers described human behavior that seemed to violate basic principles of biology and psychology, yet had proven effective in warfare. Commander Vextar read the medical reports 3 times before he could begin to process their implications. The humans had developed psychological capabilities that made them unpredictable in ways that Kelvin military doctrine could not address. A species that could hold contradictory values simultaneously could not be defeated through logical strategic planning. Within hours of receiving the medical team reports, the Kelvin High Command made a decision that shocked both species. They declared an immediate ceasefire and requested formal peace negotiations. The alien leadership had concluded that humans represented a form of consciousness that could not be conquered through conventional military means. Dr. Velcour remained on Proxima 7 for 3 additional weeks, working alongside Dr. Choi to establish joint medical protocols that could benefit both species. The collaboration forced both aliens and humans to confront their assumptions about consciousness medicine and the value of individual life. The results would change how both civilizations understood themselves. The peace negotiations took place in the human medical tent where the original revelation had occurred. Representatives from both species gathered around the makeshift operating table where Dr. Choi had saved so many lives. The symbolism was intentional, because the medical exchange had proven that cooperation was possible. Even between enemies, Captain Lee Woo-jin represented the human military forces, and he brought with him the soldiers who had participated in the medical exchange. Private Kim Tae-yoon still wore a sling for her injured shoulder, but she had insisted on attending because she wanted to see the results of what they had started. Corporal Park Min-ho brought medical supplies as a gesture of goodwill. The Kelvin delegation was led by Dr. Velkor, who had become something of a celebrity among his people for surviving psychological contact with human consciousness. The alien physician had spent weeks learning to think in ways that incorporated contradictory concepts. His reports had become required reading for Kelvin military academies. The peace treaty that emerged from these negotiations was unlike anything in galactic history. It included detailed provisions for medical cooperation between species and established protocols for treating wounded soldiers from both sides. The humans agreed to share their psychological medical techniques, while the Kelvins provided advanced medical technology. Nurse Han Sora became the first human to receive advanced Kelvin medical training, and she spent 6 months learning surgical techniques that could save lives previously considered hopeless. Her combination of human empathy and alien technology created medical capabilities that surpassed what either species could achieve alone. Dr. Velkor spent 2 years studying human psychology and emergency medicine on Earth. His research focused on understanding how humans could maintain contradictory beliefs without experiencing psychological breakdown. The alien physician learned to think like a human while retaining his Kelvin analytical abilities. The joint medical research that emerged from this collaboration revolutionized healthcare. For both species, human doctors learned to use Kelvin technology to repair injuries that had been permanent, while Kelvin physicians developed what became known as paradox therapy, the ability to make medical decisions based on both logic and emotion. Private Yoon Tae-ho, who had lost his leg in the original battle, became one of the first patients to receive a prosthetic limb designed through human Kelvin cooperation. The device used alien technology controlled by human neural patterns and allowed him to return to active duty with capabilities that exceeded his original biological limits. The medical tent that had witnessed the collapse of alien doctors was preserved as a monument to interspecies cooperation. Visitors from across the galaxy came to see the place where two civilizations had discovered that consciousness could take forms that neither had previously imagined. The war between humans and Kelvins officially ended, not with victory or defeat, but with mutual recognition that both species had been fighting over incomplete understandings of intelligence and consciousness. The conflict had revealed that the universe contained forms of thinking that were more complex and wonderful than either civilization had realized. Dr. Choi Ji-won and Dr. Velkor published joint research papers on interspecies medical cooperation that became foundational texts for the new field of xenopsychological medicine. Their work proved that consciousness could evolve in directions that seemed contradictory, but were actually complementary. The human soldiers who had participated in the medical exchange became ambassadors between the species. Captain Lee Woo-jin established training programs that taught both humans and Kelvins how to work together, despite their different approaches to logic. And emotion Corporal Lim Dong-wook, who had organized blood donations for enemy prisoners, became the first human to serve aboard a Kelvin medical ship. His ability to think both logically and emotionally made him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between species. The peace treaty included provisions for joint military exercises, where human and Kelvin forces practiced working together. The aliens learned to appreciate human unpredictability, while humans gained access to advanced Kelvin strategic planning capabilities. Private Kwon Ji-hai, who had lost her arms but continued writing letters to families of the dead, became a symbol of human resilience. Her story was taught in Kelvin schools as an example of how consciousness could find meaning in actions that seemed illogical, but served important emotional and social functions. The medical exchange had revealed that the war between humans and Kelvins was really a conflict between different forms of consciousness. Neither approach was superior, but both were incomplete. The combination of human emotional flexibility and Kelvin logical precision created capabilities that surpassed what either species could achieve alone. 5 years after the original battle on Proxima 7, the planet had become a center for interspecies medical research and training. The red sand that had once been soaked with blood from both civilizations now supported research facilities where humans and Kelvins worked together to understand consciousness and healing. The legacy of the alien doctors who collapsed when they looked inside a human medical tent was not military defeat, but rather the discovery that intelligence could take forms that neither species had previously imagined. The universe had proven to be stranger and more wonderful than anyone had expected. Dr. Choi continued to work in the original medical tent, now expanded with both human improvisation and Kelvin technology. She treated patients from dozens of different species, and her techniques were studied by medical professionals across the galaxy. The small human doctor had become a pioneer in xenopsychological medicine. The story of the medical exchange became a legend told throughout both civilizations. It demonstrated that the greatest victories could come not from defeating enemies, but from discovering that former enemies could become partners in understanding the mysteries of consciousness and existence. The war that had threatened to destroy both species had instead led to a golden age of cooperation and discovery. The humans had won not through superior weapons or tactics, but by proving that consciousness itself was more flexible and powerful than anyone had previously understood. In the end, the alien doctors who collapsed when they witnessed human medical practices had experienced something more valuable than military intelligence. They had discovered that the universe contained forms of thinking and being that could transform enemies into allies and create possibilities that neither species could have imagined alone.